up and ready to go, Phil?
You betcha, Bill. Big weekend ahead, a big Friday for Utah fans.
Yep, we'll be out in Santa Clara with the broadcast coming up on Friday night. Before we talk about those matchups, what did you make of the playoff rankings that came out last night? And then maybe, if anything, the message the committee sent with moving Utah to 5 and Oklahoma to 6?
Yeah, I think that's the way that you figured they would do it. They've had Utah ahead of Oklahoma for each of these weeks, and hopefully there's something in the committee room where they feel Utah's the more complete team because they do have a defense. They've got a potent offense, got solid special teams. So Utah really is a complete team, and I hope you see a lot of the national folks are saying, well, if Oklahoma beats Baylor, which is one spot behind, number 7, and Utah only beats the number 14 team, then Oklahoma should go. I'm not reading how 1 week determines the entire base of the season.
Yeah, the message they've sent seems to have been it's not just that Utah's got a similar record. They like the way Utah is playing within those games. They're not just looking at final scores. They're watching how Utah is playing. And Rob Mullins has mentioned on more than one occasion the dominant defense, the metrics of the offense and the defense being in the top 15 in the country and all those things, Huntley and Moss and all that stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with Oklahoma, but they haven't played the same kind of football that Utah has for the last 8 weeks.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, when you look at Oklahoma, you go back to the Texas game was a 7-point win. They lost to Kansas State. They survived a 2-point conversion against Iowa State. They trailed Baylor by a ton in the first half, came back and won that game by 3. And even TCU, they survived. TCU had the ball on their side of the field, down 4 in the fourth quarter with a chance to take the lead. So they've had a lot of close games. Meanwhile, you look on the Utah resume, and the only close game besides their loss at USC was the Washington game. And I thought that's a game where they showed a lot of heart because Washington was playing very good at that time of the season and came out of there with a solid win.
I've said for a couple of weeks, based on what I've seen the committee say, and I still believe this, Phil, if Utah beats Oregon on Friday and Georgia loses to LSU in the SEC championship game on Saturday, I believe Utah will be the 4th playoff team. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think as long as Utah can look impressive, it's not something where they get a fluky win over Oregon and Oklahoma goes out and beats Baylor by 35. Remember Ohio State a couple years ago came out and won the Big Ten title game something like 51-0. That was enough to vault them into the playoff. As long as nothing like that happens, as long as Utah looks like Utah's looked all year, and even if Oklahoma looks like Oklahoma's looked all year, then yes, Utah should be in.
Now, and I remember that game. I think it was 59-0 over Wisconsin in that Big Ten championship game. I can't see that kind of a margin. I think neither one of these teams have a great defense. Both have good offenses. I'd be very surprised if it was a blowout either way in the Baylor-Oklahoma game.
Yeah, and you go back to that first meeting that they had. Baylor had a 31-10 edge at the half, a 238-157 yard edge, and then maybe they started playing a little bit to hold on to their lead. So I would think if Oklahoma does indeed get up in this game, then you'd see Baylor continue to play its normal game and keep that one close. Should be a great game. And Baylor's got a shot of winning it even.
Give me your read. Let's go back to the Utah game. They're playing Oregon. Didn't match up in the regular season. This was kind of a game that a lot of people thought would happen before the season, and it did come to fruition. Utah has continued to play lights-out football. They blew out Colorado by 30, covered the 28 points. Oregon obviously got beat a couple of weeks back by ASU. Looked like maybe there was a little bit of a hangover in the Civil War game. Didn't really wow you against Oregon State at home, but they did win the game. What's your read on this matchup coming in on Friday, Phil?
Well, one thing I'm really looking at, Bill, is the weather because, if it's like last year's Pac-12 title game where, that thing was played in the rain and it was low scoring, 10-3, that would be a concern. And Oregon does have a very good offensive line. They're up for the Joe Moore Award for the top offensive line in the country. They've got a quarterback in Justin Herbert who, many folks think will be one of the top quarterbacks taken in the draft. They have an improved defense this year. I don't think they're as complete a team as Utah is, but they're a good team. Now, if they play like they have the last 2 weeks where they lost to Arizona State, and as you touched on, last week against Oregon State, they took on a backup quarterback, and they were only winning that thing 17-10, scored a late touchdown. They were actually outgained by Oregon State in the game. If they play anything like that this week, Utah should win comfortably. But I think that was a bit of a hangover. You'll see Oregon play its best game, and they do have a very good offensive line, quarterback, and an improved defense.
Yeah, it's going to rain, Phil. There's a 100% chance of rain Friday night. So I think you're going to see both teams rely heavily on their offensive and defensive lines. Both like to run the football first. So I think you're going to see that because it is supposed to rain.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think the advantage, when I look at the running backs, I would take the bigger guy like a Zach Moss to run the ball between the tackles for me rather than the Oregon's running backs. But the Utah defensive line against the Oregon offensive line, to me, is one of the matchups of the year. You have one of the best defensive lines in the entire country against one of the best offensive lines in the entire country, and that's going to be something worth the price of admission right there.
Well, and I can assure you both the Oregon offensive line and the Utah defensive line are sick and tired of hearing how great the other guys are. So they'll have that in their back pocket. Should be a lot of fun on Friday night. Let's bounce to a couple of the other games real fast here. Obviously, the Oklahoma-Baylor game is a big one as well. That's the first game on Saturday. It's a 10 a.m. Mountain Time kick, so a lot of Utah fans will either be waking up smiling and watching those games or be upset about it. But Oklahoma about an 8.5-point favorite, which is interesting because it took a 25-point come-from-behind win the last time around. Why do you figure the line's at 8.5 right now on this game?
I think overall when you look at these two teams on the season, Oklahoma has been more impressive. And I think if you just line up the teams on paper, I'm going to take Oklahoma's offense over Baylor's offense. Jalen Hurts has a 31-6 ratio. Charlie Brewer 20-6. I like the C.D. Lamb. I think he's one of the best receivers in the country. Mims is good, but I don't think he's quite up there with Lamb. And defensively, Oklahoma has actually been playing better defense the last 3 weeks. In the last 3 weeks, they have held their opponents to about 140 yards below their season average. They're only giving up slightly under 300 yards per game. So they're playing better defense. They've got the offense going. They'll have C.D. Lamb back. They didn't have C.D. Lamb in that first game against Baylor, and I think that's why they're favored in this one.
Do you like Oklahoma in this game, or do you like Baylor?
I like Oklahoma to win the game, but I think Baylor's going to make a game of it. And the one big advantage I think Oklahoma has, they've been on this stage before. You look at the last 2 years, they've been in the Big 12 title game. The last 2 years, they've won the Big 12 title game comfortably. They beat TCU 41-17, and even last year, it was closer than the final score would indicate. They got a late score to get ahead of it, but they won the game 39-27. So they've been in these big games before. For Baylor, the first big game was probably that Oklahoma game where they had where they hosted the game. This will be their first big game at a neutral site.
Utah's been in that championship game, too. That's the reason why Zach Moss and Lecky Fotu and Bradley and I came back this year. So I think it'll be interesting to see their advantage having been in that game last year versus Oregon, who'll be playing in that stage for the first time. Obviously, the other championship game that people here in Utah in Salt Lake City will be paying attention to if Utah handles their business on Friday night is the SEC championship game where LSU goes into Atlanta, Georgia's backyard, and they'll have 40,000. Georgia will have 40,000. There'll be about 200,000 outside the stadium partying at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. LSU a 7-point favorite, undefeated. Georgia's got the one loss, the home loss to South Carolina, 7-point dog. They're going to be missing one of their wide receivers due to injury, another one missing a half due to the punch that he threw last week. Does that impact the game in your mind, Phil?
It does in my mind. And once again, Georgia has an advantage in the fact they've played here the last 2 years. It is a site they're very familiar with. And you go back to 2 years ago, they beat Auburn in that game to win the SEC title. And last year probably should have beaten Alabama. They had that thing locked up and sealed. Alabama made a big comeback, came back and beat them. But they've played very well in this venue, in this game. So I think that's a nice edge to have for Georgia. And this is one of those irresistible force meets a movable object. Georgia's got the best defense in the SEC, giving up just 265 yards per game. And then LSU, of course, one of the best offenses. But, yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. Without Lawrence Cager, who's out, he was their top receiver when he got injured. And without George Pickens in the first half, if you look at the talent LSU has in the secondary, they've got like 3 first-rounders in the secondary. So I would lock up my defensive backs one-on-one with what looks like a pedestrian Georgia receiving corps. And Jake Fromm's been struggling without Cager. The last 3 games, he's hit 40 passes out of about 80. He's hit slightly under 50% of his passes. Swift is banged up. Remember last year in the SEC championship game, Auburn had banged up running backs, and that really affected them. So you wonder if Swift will be 100%. But I'll lock up my DBs on those receivers, bring the extra guy in the box to either take away Swift or blitz the quarterback. I think LSU's got an advantage there. And I also think LSU's offense could pretty much move the ball on anybody this year, and we'll be able to move the ball in Georgia. Georgia hasn't taken on a lot of elite offenses this year, something behind their defensive numbers. So I think LSU will have some success there. I like LSU to win this one probably by double digits.
All right, LSU and Georgia, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Clemson, Virginia. Those are both double digits. Ohio State's a 16.5-point favorite. Clemson a 28.5-point favorite. Do you see either one of these games being real competitive, Phil?
Not really. I think if you go back, though, and look at the Ohio State-Wisconsin first game, that was in Columbus. The first 9 possessions of the game were all punts. Ohio State scored 10 points in the last 3-4 minutes of the half to take a 10-0 lead. It was 10-7 in the third quarter, and then they scored on 4 straight possessions in the second half. The second 2 off of fumbles. I think it'll be a lower-scoring game, which gives Wisconsin a chance to hang in there, and I think if they can get their running back, Jonathan Taylor, going, he's had 2 pretty poor games against Ohio State the last 2 times he played them. If they can get him uncovered and moving a little bit against that Ohio State defense, then I think they have a chance because I think Wisconsin's defense will play well.
Phil Steele's our guest from philsteele.com right here on ESPN 700. You can also find him on Twitter at PhilSteele042. So will this weekend, in your mind, have any impact on the Heisman race?
I don't see it happening. I think it's Joe Burrow, number one. And even if he was to have a rare bad game, LSU's still going to make the playoff. And he's got so many more big performance games over everybody else. I think it's his. And his closest competition is probably one of the Ohio State guys. But if you're an Ohio State voter, do you vote for Chase Young? Or do you vote for J.K. Dobbins, or do you vote for Justin Fields? I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of vote split there because you can make a case Dobbins is their best Heisman candidate. You can make a case Fields is their best Heisman candidate, and you can make a case Chase Young is their best Heisman candidate. So I think that's going to cancel each other out and pretty much hand the award to Joe Burrow.
Hey, Joe Burrow's had a fantastic year, and ironically enough was an Ohio State guy a few years ago, too, that apparently couldn't win the job, but now he may get his sweet revenge in both the Heisman and perhaps in the playoff as well. So it's interesting looking at these games. You know, obviously here people are worried about what guys like Paul Feinbaum and Joey Galloway say, and it's what I tell people all the time. I think this committee doesn't really care what guys like Phil Steele and Bill Riley and Paul Feinbaum and Joey Galloway say. I think they're locked in that room, and I think they're doing their job. I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement if we play the chalk here. Do you?
You know, and here's the thing I like, Bill, about this year's committee, and it goes back to Ohio State getting past LSU. And what was the reasoning behind that? The reasoning behind it was Ohio State's the most complete team, a more complete team than LSU. LSU has a dynamic offense. Ohio State's got a dynamic offense. LSU's defense has shown a lot of warts this year. Ohio State's defense hasn't. That's why Ohio State's a better team. I think if you go by that philosophy, wow, that's Utah, Oklahoma, 1 for 1. Utah has not shown any warts defensively. They've shown they have a very good offense, and they've shown they've had special teams. They are a more complete team than Oklahoma. So using the same philosophy that they did for the switch of 1-2, that seems to go in favor of Utah. So I think the committee is in the corner of Utah in that respect because they're looking for the most complete teams in the playoff.
I just like the reason you have the committee and not the computers, Phil, is to factor in more than just numbers itself. It's to watch the games and to see that stuff. Use the analytics, but also use your eyeballs and use your common sense. And I think so far, at least, the committee's done that.
Yeah, and I think if you look at Utah and you look at that defensive line, you have to say that's one of the best defensive lines in the country. You look at that secondary; they've got some of the best players in the secondary in the country. Zach Moss. Let's keep him healthy. As long as he's healthy, they've got one of the best running backs. And Tyler Huntley, what a season. I mean, he's right up there with every stat you want. I think he's, number 2 to 5 in pass efficiency. He's right at the top of the ratings, having a fantastic season. So they really are a complete team. And even the offensive line, Bill, if you've been watching them, I think they've been maturing as the season goes on. And we're seeing that offensive line play its best ball down the stretch.
Jim Harding is one heck of an offensive line coach, and he took a group with 3 new starters and very, very little experience, and they're now playing. They may not be at Oregon's level yet, but those guys have played together for 4 years. This is an offensive line that's come together very nicely. They've protected Tyler Huntley. They've opened some nice stuff for Zach Moss. And really the X factor through all this has been Andy Ludwig. His appearance here as the offensive coordinator back after 10 years away, I think has been the difference between last year's Huntley and this offense and what they're doing this year.
Yeah, and how about the emergence of Brandt Kiti at the tight end spot and using him as a all-purpose guy. I think that's really helped as well. So I've been impressed. You know, you come into the season, if you use your old parameters, you're thinking Utah's a defensive special teams team with a very average offense. That's not the case this year. They really are the complete team.
All right, Phil, here's your stat. Every year in the Pac-12 championship game, the higher-ranked team has gone on to win the Pac-12 championship.
That's a good stat for Utah fans. How about that?
Not that it means anything this year, but it is a good stat.
Yeah, and last year was a really good game. You know, I think if not for the interception return for a touchdown, who knows what would have happened in that one. But I like the fact that Utah was here last year and played, and that experience level is going to help them.
All right, Phil, enjoy it. We'll catch up with you again next week to sort through where the bowl games are.
Sounds great, Bill. You have a great weekend, my friend, and stay dry out there in San Francisco.
I will do my best. That's the great Phil Steele.